Hello, I am Corey Hammond, and I'm going to be talking about Chapter 11, which focuses on diversity and the achievement gap. So here we go. So the first part that this chapter talks about, that's very much relevant to the culturally responsive teaching practice is addressing your own bias, right? So that is a huge component of trying to teach culturally responsibly. So acknowledging that race is a myth, thinking about how all Homo sapiens had the same genetic ability and that there's no difference depending on one's skin color. That any achievement gap that we discuss is based on social conditions that have been created, and that really skin color is a adaptation that is formed based on environment throughout Homo sapiens time on Earth. So knowing the history of that, acknowledging how the human race has developed throughout time, and that any achievement gap is really been constructed through our own society and not one's abilities. So with that in mind, switching gears to the achievement gap. So what is it? It's a term that's used a lot that some people still have a hard time grappling with. So how are students of color performing differently compared to their white peers? So a few statistics that the book shares. 2011, Blacks and Hispanic students performed 20% lower than whites at the elementary and middle school level. And they also shared that they were typically about 2 grade levels behind their white peers. And then thinking about other minorities, the model minority myth, the belief that Asian and Pacific Islander students do not need extra help. So kind of the opposite effect of when teachers or schools, districts see Asian and Pacific Islander students as performing higher and not needing as much support. And the book shared a really interesting study that if you don't lump them all together, if you actually break down by nationality, different Asian countries and different places that those students are coming from or their parents are coming from, is very clear the pattern that there's specific groups within that larger Asian population that do need help with reading. So that was a really interesting statistic in there. And then this graphic that I added on the right is a little different lens, but similar idea. Students that are eligible for free or reduced price lunch versus ones that are not. So basically, instead of looking at it through a racial lens, looking at it through an economic lens. So, which is obviously very much correlated, but that students who are receiving free lunch are within that greater achievement gap, as you can see on the chart. And that other graphic up the top there was just really interesting to have the teacher on the left-hand side with the white students, and then on the right side having the black students was just, yeah, very good graphic for that concept. So this chapter also talked about Common Core, which I'm really glad it did. Common Core was created as a national standard so that all states would have the same expectations, so that if a student moves from one state to the other, they're picking up hopefully close to where they left off. Supposed to be preparing for college, whether or not they attend, and this is becoming more common for all subject matters, so not just reading and math, but also for science, for the arts, to create a more nationwide standard. So while those were the intentions, were to create standard expectations, what concerns are we still having? It's created a huge focus on standardized testing. There's been a lot of investments from corporations, either on the curriculum end, the testing end, charter schools, that are basically deciding what materials are going to be use to implement Common Core. So the question is there enough of a focus on critical thinking and a diversity of sources from people of color within Common Core? And just to kind of throw in my own opinion here that with the intentions in mind, I think that Common Core can still be used in culturally relative teaching, depending on what sources you used. And that was a big plus when Common Core came out, was a lot of teachers feeling like they could adapt some of these more broad standards into almost any text. So I think the focus that the concerns that the book addresses are very much more on the curriculums that are coming out from Common Core. Because really Common Core, the way it's written, at least for language arts, is very much how a student looks at a text or looks at their writing. And it can allow the teacher to also be using their own sources that can create a culturally relative approach. So depending on how you are framing your students' units, thinking about how the books that you're using, the questions that you're asking, and kind of working backwards, right? So backwards lesson planning there. I'll keep going. I'll come back to that. But so the achievement gap, what do we do about it? Again, connecting to culturally relative teaching, knowing your student, caring about your student, some examples that they gave: home visits, preschool, integrated schools. They gave a few examples that they had talked about earlier in the book with comprehensive programs. One of the examples I really liked was the algebra project that connects real world experiences from the curriculum to your students. So their example was making a drum or riding on the subway and using math to solve problems that were related to the students' experiences, which is also obviously part of culturally relative teaching. Big focus on all the examples and within CRT is parent involvement. And that's also showing you in this graphic here that I found the 6 different approaches to help is family and community engagement. So how are you connecting with the community, which is another focus, is that schools are a community center and for learning, right? Other ways that we've talked about before: creating goals with your students, affirming student identity. What are you doing to make sure that you are giving them academic support, building that relationship? So all the things that we've talked about before, but really putting it at the student-centered approach as well. It also talked about technology, which is so relevant for as we move through coronavirus in the spring and possibly in the fall this year, is how are we going to keep up this rigorous CRT approach online? So they gave a lot of good examples, which of course it felt so close to home right now. Creating student pages, having whole class online discussion, so stimulating that experience that they would have in the classroom, holding office hours. They talked a lot about small group instruction or tutoring. And to me, that was one of the biggest components that technology and during this time can give us, is that as an elementary school teacher, that you're able to pull kids without being distracted with other students. So really being able to focus on 3 students at a time and having small groups be on a call together and focus on them can really help achieve closing that achievement gap. Another thing they talked about was, especially in launching projects, is explaining vocabulary and concepts first and then having students read and learn and analyze. So I think, I forget what the example was in the book. I think basically, if you're having them explore a topic that's related to social justice, you need to define what social justice is before having them learn about different leaders within the field. Another great example that they gave was sending individual messages from students. Having that correspondence one-on-one can create that trusting and building relationship aspect. So there's so much to break down in this chapter, especially as it kind of wrapped up the entire book. But I loved a chart that they had on successful students is very similar to successful teachers. If you as a teacher do not care about learning, if you do not care about bettering yourself, bettering your students, if you do not believe in your abilities, then how are you going to expect your students to do that, right? So everything that you as a teacher bring is what you should expect for your students to bring. So if you are not showing up, if you do not care about furthering your own learning, then why would your students? And that was very powerful to me, and something that I know can be very hard for a lot of teachers. It also had talked a lot about schools being community centers. So in talking about charter schools versus public schools, how are schools becoming a center? And again, that connects back to parent involvement. Is it an open place for discussion? Is it a place that parents are invested in and care about and look at as a resource, right? Students live complicated lives, right? There's so many other aspects that can contribute to this achievement gap. And definitely at times I've felt the same way, where how much can I help when I know that my students, aren't getting health care, aren't eating enough or eating the right food, or, coming in hungry, things like that, that are external from their lives in the classroom. But really meeting them where they are, and finding out those little things that you can do can make a huge difference. And the other example from this chapter was from Lemon Grove here in San Diego, talking about how they did offer healthcare and dental care, which I want to learn more about that, because that is fascinating and amazing to me, and really addresses this point of schools being a place for them to grow and giving them those opportunities if we can. So again, culturally relative teaching, caring, needs to focus on the relationship between the student and the teacher, belief in diversity being a strong asset to your classroom, and social justice. So making sure that we all are caring about how our students are being treated inside and outside the classroom. The last point that I really love that they made was finding teachers that are also dedicated to coaching and guiding students to be their very best. So, there's that famous article about finding your marigold teacher, basically meaning that find that teacher, find those group of people that are going to not tell you it's too hard or difficult or out of reach, that we really can make a difference and believe that that's possible. And last but not least, this little graphic kind of sums up a lot of what I've talked about: recognizing our own biases, connecting to families, bringing in real world experiences to your lessons, keeping high expectations, all of these things that are going to make our classrooms more relative, more safe, more successful for our students. And that is how chapter 11 connected to our bigger theme of culturally responsive and relative teaching. Make sure I'm good on time. Perfect. All right, thank you.